Welcome to the Powerful Entrepreneur Podcast. So welcome to the series that is a continuation of our collection of stories from the book, The Powerful Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Arthur, and today we're going to be talking about Rome, the great ancient Rome. So it all came to me in two distinct moments, the story for this article. First, I was reading about the ancient Roman writer Vegetius, and one of his quotes stood out to me. An adversary is more hurt by desertion than by slaughter. Immediately I said, this is some great game theory methodology, but I want to extract usage in the world of everyday entrepreneurs. But how? Later that week, one of our clients had experienced a moment of what the Romans called decimation, or better known as desertion. In the modern world, we prefer to use a far less brutal term, turnover. As Vegetius spoke literally about an adversary, any single entrepreneur can pull this quote back to themselves by saying, how can I learn from the weakness of my enemy? Let's jump right into the heart of this story, Rome. Not really the Rome that you necessarily think of. We are dropping back to 500 BC Rome. The small kingdom had just recently become a republic, another grand story for another time. And the Roman monarchy was dismantled in order to build the Roman Republic around the citizens of Rome. Two consuls were elected to run Rome, and gradually over time, the Roman Senate accumulated more power and voice for the citizens of Rome. These institutions were in a fragile state, to say the least. While the ruling parties that oversaw Rome were experiencing periods of upheaval, the lands around Rome were consistently being threatened by their neighboring factions. Rome was only a collection of a handful of small cities that surrounded Rome. This was very early on in the history of Rome. There was no empire, there was no strong centurion army, and there was absolutely no guarantees as to the lineage of the Roman people. One group that was threatening the sovereignty of Roman lands was the Volsci. These were Italian neighbors of Rome, not much different than the Romans themselves, although in a time of true barbaric necessity, the Volsci and the Romans were brutal enemies. Conflict at this time was far from the depiction we often see in movies and video games. These were raiding conflicts, one town sacking another in a quick raid to take spoils to their own vulnerable settlements. The back and forth created an ever-increasing hatred for one another that eventually settled in the larger capital cities to engage in a formal campaign of retribution. Furthermore, the Volsci were not just content on raiding Roman villages. They were aggressively settling in Roman territory with the hopes of furthering their access to fertile lands. Finally, there was the Roman war against the Latins, another neighboring group. This threatened the balance of the small region in the favor of Rome, hence the motivation to carry out a more formal invasion of the Roman lands by the Volsci. After a series of battles, raids, and engagements that saw to the early victory of the Volscian tribes, the Romans needed to ready the citizens of Rome for war. This was at a time when the plebeians of Rome were in a constant struggle for staying power within the Roman hierarchy. The careful balancing of the loyalty of the people alongside the survival of the city of Rome was on the minds of every aristocrat in Rome. Any army was able to be mustered from the shouting hordes of plebs, and a march into Volscian lands commenced. The story has been romanticized countless times throughout the history of Rome, but the hero of our story, Gaius Marcius Coriolanus, made his way into the legends of Rome. During a siege of an important Volscian town, Gaius was on watch and saw that the Volsci were sallying out of their town in an attack against the Roman army. Gaius wasted no time and gathered a small band of soldiers to counterattack the Volscian sally. His band fought their way through the rushing enemies and through the gates of the town itself, eventually setting fire to some bordering houses along the inside of the town walls. This set panic and forced the surrender of the Volscian town. War at this time was far from concluded at the end of a single battle, but the taking of a key settlement could offer the weight of balance in favor of the Rome for years to come. It just so happened that almost directly after this key battle was won for Rome, a great famine struck the Roman lands. So bad was this famine that the Roman people had to plead for help to their great enemies in the south, the Volsci. Reluctantly, the Volsci decided to assist the starving people of Rome, and this saw a period of peace between the two great peoples. This peace was further established by the invitation for a congregation of Volsci elites to join Rome in the games that the city was holding in celebration. Things were looking upward between the two enemies, but all was not perfect by any means. During the famine, large shipments of grain were being sent to Rome from many of their neighbors. Gaius spoke out against the plebeian class, for which he pleaded with the Senate to only distribute the grain to the people in exchange for the reversal of some pro-plebeian laws. This did not win him any favor, and he was subject to potential sentencing, for our once heroic champion Gaius had felt scorned by many in Rome during his rise as a Roman legend. In probably one of the best tales from early Rome, the great hero Gaius leaves Rome. Gaius approached the enemy city in the cover of a disguise and joined alongside the Volscian leader. Gaius was well accepted and was given charge over council with the Volscian elites. Gaius wanted to seek retribution against Rome, but needed to plead with the Volsci to do so. A great scheme was conducted in which the Roman Senate was tricked into expelling the Volscian delegation out of Rome during the games of celebration. This trick and the resulting expulsion was so offensive to the Volsci elite that the reemergence of war was afforded a listening ear. Gaius led a great army of Volsci in the Roman lands and set about conquering multiple towns and cities. For Gaius knew the lands, he knew the people, the strengths, the weaknesses of the Roman territory. The Volsci were so efficient in their offensive that they were awarded with this eventual siege of Rome itself. As the city of Rome prepared for a siege against the Volsci force, it was apparent that no martial method could be employed to spare the city from conquest. The plebeians refused to fight, and the council was forced to sue peace. At first, they sent diplomats, then priests, to no avail. The Volsci were set on destroying Rome. Finally, the mother of Gaius, his wife, and a collection of Roman matrons approached the Volscian camp. They were accepted and allowed to plead for the survival of Rome. Gaius pulled back from the siege of Rome and marched his army back into Volscian territory. Rome was at the brink of destruction. The prodigy of a millennium-strong empire could have been lost by one man's betrayal. So I'm sure after reading this story of betrayal and desertion, one can make the obvious claim, well, it's obvious, betrayal hurts. While a correct assumption, also a limited one. For betrayal in the 21st century is far from black and white, as it was during the time of barbaric, warring factions. One thing we should do is bring it back to the original motivation for this piece, with the line from Vegetius, "An adversary is more hurt by desertion than by slaughter." If we take this into the context of the 5th century BC, it is an easy correlation to make. But if we try to apply it to the 21st century, a far greater context can be derived. Let's first try to start with the idea that we, as a 21st century entrepreneur, are currently engaged to achieve some great accomplishment, or we are trying to prevent some horrible occurrence. Both are routine to our business activity every single day. Also, we surround ourselves with the crucial team members in the hope that their knowledge and experience will supplant our own lack of. These assumptions set the schedule from here. We are attempting to win a big deal. Our BD team is strong. We are out there conquering, winning meetings, and aligning our competencies. We are expelling significant resources to acquire this deal, months and months and months of BD budget. Finally, the call comes in. Client says, "We are moving in another direction." It hurts. It hurts bad. We still have our team, though. Everyone fails and learns something great. We have the team to go after the next big client engagement later that afternoon. A great example of 21st century slaughter. Similar scenario. We are investing countless resources into an initiative to build a new internal software for our workforce. We want our jobs to be easier so that we can make more money. All of a sudden, 2 months into the project, your lead engineer takes a job offer at another company. He or she was the linchpin in the whole project, or was just a crucial member of the team. They are gone, perhaps taking your designs and ideas with them. In either case, the team now has to cannibalize from the inside to reassert dominance over the project timeline. Resources that were once scheduled to go to development are now being used to bring on recruiters. Potentially, the cost becomes so great that scrapping the project may seem like the best option. VGTS would have no problem claiming desertion here. We can create hundreds of examples of the comparison between what VGTS called slaughter, defeat through action, and desertion, employee turnover. VGTS has been correct for over a millennium, and your entrepreneurial practice of today is not spared from this same logic. So a few weeks back, I was telling a good coworker friend of mine that this was the topic of conversation these next few weeks for all the people involved in the Powerful Entrepreneur series. And I don't think I've ever seen an eyebrow get raised so high in my entire life by this person. And the reason because of that is because I think they had a hard time digesting the fact that, we were comparing our 21st century selves to this barbaric story of betrayal, slaughter, siege warfare. Our once ally is now leading the enemy legions to our gates, and he knows all of our lands, where all of our watchtowers are, where all of our scouting forces would go. He pretty much knows everything about us, so he's able to just, Gaius was just able to get on Rome so fast. And if it wasn't for his mother, his wife, and the matrons of Rome, he would have taken it, and it would have ended Rome forever, most likely. So, that eyebrow that got raised when I saw it, I said to myself, well, what do you think about that Vegetius quote? And they said, well, we get it, we understand it, but like how? How does that make any sense to the 21st century? Well, I gave them a few of the examples I was using and to explain it, and they said to me, well, turnover is such a big deal nowadays that it's almost something we can't avoid, right? Like losing people is something that we as a company just can't avoid. We're going to lose people. Especially with the younger workforce, the millennial workforce, you kind of just have to expect it a little bit. And I agreed. I said, yeah, absolutely. I think, part of being a strong employer today is also about embracing the needs of your employees, right? You need to embrace their needs. And sometimes their needs are to leave, get a new job. Truly, you can't always retain people. Sometimes growth can only be found in the next step, right? So as an employer, you're going to have to not only accept the fact that people are going to leave, but you kind of have to embrace it if you want to be a strong employer, because you're never going to be able to provide the level of challenge to your employees if you don't just anticipate them leaving, but also plan on them leaving. Right? That's the key. Don't just anticipate that people are going to leave. Plan for them to leave. Think about it. If you go, it's like let's go back to Gaius here. Now, let's say when Gaius became one of the heroes of Rome, what was the problem? Gaius had an opinion, he had a voice that did not mesh well with the higher classes of Rome. The plebeians were annoyed, they were irritated, they did not like the Senate. There was a lot of issues in regards to the political makeup of the times. And Gaius came in and said, hey, well, I'm the hero, listen to me. And that didn't fly in Rome. So he felt ousted, right? He felt like his voice wasn't being heard when he deserved it. Does that sound familiar, everyone? You seem like you may have that employee in your midst, that millennial 2 years ago was an intern and now is questioning every single manager in your department. I'm sure it exists. It's just, what do we do about it? Do we want that person to stay? I'm sure. Absolutely we want that person to stay. What do? Do we quell their opinion? I'm sure that some of the largest organizations on the planet would agree with that. Quell their opinion. Make them stop. They're causing dissent. Or do we expect them to leave? Set them up for failure. Right? I know a lot of organizations that do that. Set them up for failure immediately by saying, you know what, they're not happy here. We're not really happy with them. We'll let them quit someday. They'll just quit. It's okay. Or do we embrace their plan to leave? Like, they have a plan to leave. They want to be challenged elsewhere. Right? Now, if we embrace their plan to leave, they're not happy. Well, now all of a sudden, we're thinking about not just that employee that is unhappy. We're also now changing the dialogue we have around all of our employees. That every single one of them could have a plan to leave. What do we do to counter that? Well, we create plans for them to stay. You know what? That one employee who's causing dissent within your management group, you know what? Maybe they need to be in sales. Maybe they need to have a voice. Maybe they need to try something different. Maybe that internship they did 2 years ago was just the first inkling of their strengths as a long-term employee of your organization. The fact is that a lot of companies act like the Roman Senate. They see a threat and they inside and they create expectations that are going to be the failure of that individual. They create these expectations by having a groupthink at the management level. Well, 80% of your managers think that person's a bad person. That person's bad. Oh, then obviously that's the case. That employee needs to go. Let's set him up for failure by giving him expectations for him to fail. Well, what happens? That employee leaves your team in a bad place, takes some intellectual property with them. Maybe you now have an enemy on the outside of the organization. They don't like you. They don't like your company. I don't think so. I think nowadays in the 21st century, if you are still treating employees like that, even if they are a nightmare employee, which I personally very rarely see, very rarely, if you're still treating employees like that, your company will fail probably in the next decade or two as the millennial and Gen Z workforce starts to dominate the scene. Because you can't just expect people to either adhere to your methods or adhere to your expectations. You can't just expect someone to fail. You can't just expect someone to walk a certain path. You have to plan for that person to leave. You have to do everything in your power to ensure that your workforce is challenged, rewarded, and honored for whether they bring law, a voice of reason, voice of logic, or a voice of creativity, or voice of chaos, voice of dissent. All companies need those to survive. Because too much of one or the other, I've seen too many failures with just too much of one or too much of the other. So be like what Vegeta says. It is better for slaughter than for decimation. People leaving. Slaughter is better. Being defeated as a company is better because you know what? You still have all those people around you to pick yourself back up. You lose that client deal, those people are there. They're happy, they're working hard for you, they're going to be there to help you achieve. Now, they leave, where does that leave you? Thank you, Vegetius, for that beautiful quote. And thank you, Rome, for providing this story for us. And thank you to all the entrepreneurs out there trying to make their adventures fruitful for their groups of employees. And if you are an employee and you're listening to this story, thank you for your hard work. And honestly, don't stop being creative in the workforce. It's very important. All right, take care, everyone. This is Arthur signing off. Powerful Entrepreneur Podcast. See you next time.